Hey, good morning, everyone. I have 9 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started, and we'll probably still have folks joining us over the next few minutes, but that is just fine. My name is Kyle Foster, and I am a staff member at the Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Education, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Council for Online Learning Excellence to week 2 of the 2019 Learning Innovation Summit. We have a great week planned to finish us off. Two fantastic presentations today. Of course, this one that we're about to begin, and then one this afternoon that we hope you can join us for. So just a few things to get us kicked off here that I would like to share with you. Obviously, the best way to listen to this session is going to be using your computer audio. So if you're not connected to through your computer, that's going to be the best way to get the best experience. For this webinar, you will use the Q&A box to type your questions. If you're joining via the Zoom interface, you should see that at the bottom of your window. So just click that Q&A box, type any questions you may have, and we'll keep track of those and make sure that those get answered as we go. If you are watching on the Facebook live stream, you can feel free to type your questions as comments on the stream, and we can answer those as well. The session will be recorded, and the recording will be posted to the Summit website, onlineexcellence.onenet.net, and all of our recordings are posted there. So feel free, if you haven't been able to attend a session that you were interested in, all of those are up at this point. So go out and take a look there, and please also feel free to share this recording with colleagues whom you think could benefit from it. We want this shared far and wide and to benefit the most number of people possible. The other thing that I would like to do before we get started is to congratulate the recipients of the 2019 Oklahoma Online Learning Excellence Awards. These are awards that we give out each year, and they are to recognize excellence in online learning in the state of Oklahoma. They're chosen by a panel of colleagues after a nomination process. We had a lot of fantastic nominations this year, and I'm pleased to say that our recipients this year for the Teaching Award are Professor Dawn M. Pierce from the University of Central Oklahoma. The Innovation Award this year goes to the Institute for Learning Environment Design, also at UCO. And the Leadership Individual Award this year goes to Marcy Grant at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. So if you know those folks, please whenever you see them, offer them congratulations on some excellent work and the great things that they're doing for the state of Oklahoma. They will be recognized later on this month at the April State Regents meeting and presented with their awards at that time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter for today. I am pleased that Rob Carr from AbleTech is able to join us. Rob is the ICT program manager for AbleTech, and he'll tell you a little bit more about what his agency does once he takes over. I'm sure that many of you who are watching today have worked with Rob in some capacity. If your institution has done any kind of accessibility training or plan, he is all over the state helping higher education with our accessibility issues, and does a fantastic job of that. Rob has done a lot of in-person trainings for us over the last year, and we were working with him to do some online type trainings for members of the new Oklahoma Online Consortium. So if your institution is a member of that, be on the lookout for those opportunities later on this year. So with that, Rob, I will turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Kyle, and thank you everybody for joining us here this morning to talk about accessibility at a little bit different level maybe than what at least we have before, if I've talked with you about it, and maybe a little different than what you're kind of used to thinking about. We're going to talk about accessibility across a higher education institution with the idea, as a former boss of mine always said, that many hands make light work. And we're going to discuss a bit, how basically to look at accessibility as a program, in other words, something that has a broad reach on campus. And a lot of this is recognizing that when we do accessibility, much of the time now, we tend to put all the eggs into one basket, right? So we might have a situation where there's one person maybe there's one department that is really key to and responsible for accessibility. And this can be true within an academic unit, and this can also be true with a campus. I've worked with some campuses here in the state where they really take this approach. They say, okay, one individual is going to make all of our PDFs accessible, whether they're aimed at our students or they're aimed out to the public at large through our website. And this becomes kind of the accepted model. Instead, what I want to do this morning is look around a little bit to find where accessibility lives. And this whole thing is based on a relatively short thought that has some kind of ripples. And that thought is that accessibility is fundamental to technology. So wherever there is technology, accessibility is really already there. And a lot of the time it's a matter of exposing it. So if you think about just the World Wide Web, for example, accessibility is central and fundamental to the web. And that's one of the things, and you may have seen a quote from a guy named Tim Berners-Lee, who's credited with actually coming up with the World Wide Web, that talks about how accessibility is fundamental. This image takes a look at a little snip of the web around Wikipedia. And one of the things that's on here off to the right is actually conformance to web content accessibility guidelines. So even in a diagram like this that tries to show a bunch of the relationships, we see accessibility. If it's fundamental to the web, if it's fundamental to our digital, then it follows that it's fundamental to design. Just as fundamental as responsive and thinking about how a student might interact with a piece of learning content on their device, whatever size it might be. Accessibility is built into our design as well. It's built in then when we implement a design, whether it's course design or web design, it's already there. It's as fundamental as color choice, for example. If you think about your institutional colors and the influence that that might have on the learning environment, it's usually pretty significant. Your learning management system is likely branded with your university colors. Able Tech is based out of Oklahoma State University. For those of you who have seen the campaigns over the years, it's America's Brightest Orange. And I say this all the time. America's Brightest Orange is a little bit tricky when it comes to color contrast in particular. It doesn't contrast that well with light color. So something as fundamental as color choice and the colors that we sometimes have that aren't a choice comes down to being just built into the design of the web. It's as fundamental as structure. So there's just a bunch of code up here. But this is HTML. This is how a learning management system delivers a web page to a browser or delivers a course to a browser. And again, accessibility is fundamental to HTML. We have a lot of accessibility standards built up around not only what's delivered to the browser, but also the environment that you might use in your learning management system to build a course out. And there are accessibility standards that underlie all of this stuff, the visible design with color, as well as the structure. There are standards that define what we need to do to make these things accessible. So the way that I view it is our challenge is to expose accessibility in the roles where it already lives. So to keep from kind of putting all the eggs in one basket. And I don't even say that it's a matter of putting accessibility into roles, because again, I think it's already there. And it's a matter of just pulling that out and exposing it so that that basket situation isn't one that we perpetuate. We don't continue to put ourselves in a spot where we're trying to bottleneck everything through one office, or we're trying to centralize everything around accessibility. Instead, we're trying to expose where it naturally fits. So in general, the way that I frame this is with any technology, we've got two different categories of folks. We have the doers. So these are the people that sit at a keyboard and create the thing. And the thing could be a website, it could be an online course, it could be a PowerPoint slide deck. So you have the folks who actually sit and do and create these things, but they don't operate on an island. There's a lot of influence on the work that the doer actually does, right? So since, as well, I just gave the example of Oklahoma State's Orange being an influence on web and print and course designers on OSU's campuses. So influencers might oversee the work, they may guide it directly, they might just kind of steer a little bit loosely. And in some cases, they might not have direct influence over whoever's actually doing the work. So we have a little bit of a Where's Waldo game. So we have a whole bunch of folks here who are all dressed as Waldo and I would kind of like to know what event this is, where there are a whole bunch of people dressed up as Waldo. But that's a little bit of how I look at this, to add a little bit of levity. We want to go in and find the doers and the influencers. So the way that I'll do this, and I'll go through this by way of example here in just a couple of minutes. And for some of you all, I might have come in and worked with your institution to go through this process where we say, all right, let's talk about a technology. And we'll pick one here in a sec that works in the context of online learning. But let's start at what gets delivered to a browser or gets emailed out to an audience. And let's work our way back from that to people. Let's find who is responsible. Let's again expose accessibility, doers and influencers who do or influence that particular digital thing. And the last step, which I don't think we'll get too deeply into today, even though it's really critical, is to figure out the accessibility skills or knowledge that align really well with those roles and begin to work toward making sure that those roles have the skills or knowledge that fits, because that can vary. And that might be, that's literally a part 2 of this talk. So let's start, since we're in an academic setting, with an online course. And I'm just going to go through and sketch out in general some of the doers and influencers that I've observed in working with many institutions around the state, and just kind of looking at what folks are doing around the country as well. So if we think about an online course, you might think first and foremost of the instructional designer sitting at their desk, building the course out. And again, no one is an island. So we have a lot of folks that influence the work that the instructional designer does. So one of the first folks that I thought of is the instructor themselves. The instructor ideally works really closely with the instructional designer. And ideally, everyone's in a situation where it's a very collaborative kind of relationship. The course ends up being not just a repackage of the brick and mortar course when it's piped out through an LMS, and even in a blended situation, ideally, it's a strong enough collaboration to where the instructor is hand in hand with the instructional designer, creating a learning environment that works, right? That's effective for the students. So certainly the instructor has a tremendous influence. And I think too, instructors in this setting can be both a doer and an influencer, because in a lot of cases, instructors are actually going to have content. So for example, the instructor might use this pie chart. So the pie chart has 4 slices of pie, and each one is labeled. There's a key off to the right for categories 1 through 4. Now, in terms of accessibility, what the class actually needs is more like this. So I won't get too much into the nuts and bolts of accessibility around this. However, we've moved the category labels to where they're adjacent to the little slices of pie so that people don't have to rely on the color to identify which is which. And we made the line between the slices a little bit more bold. So this can go a number of different directions. So the instructor could obstruct and say, no, we need to use the pie chart the way that I created it. Or the instructor can facilitate that and either go in and redo it or work with and be open to the instructional designer, creating a more accessible version of that same chart. So it can go either way in a situation like this. So even with this situation, this particular context, we have a situation where the instructor is a doer and an influencer. And Kyle, it looks like a couple of questions come through.
Yeah, I think we've had a couple people have issues seeing some of the presentation, so we're
Oh,
working on getting that.
okay.
It may be a Zoom issue. If anybody is having a problem seeing, just type it in the Q&A box and we'll get it solved.
And I will say, in terms of the slides, it's a very visual presentation, so you're not missing much content. I'm reading the text or describing a bit, so hopefully it's not taking away from, and I was reading through a couple of the comments, you couldn't see the pie chart. So again, I hit the high points of what is or is not a little bit more accessible there. And so I'll continue to do that, knowing that we're having some trouble with the visuals. Sorry about that. So again, we're in a situation where we need to move from point A to point B. We need a piece of accessible content. So this can bring in yet someone else to the conversation who's outside of the design side of the conversation itself. And it may be that at some point, in order to go one way or the other, we need to take a look at the department chair. So a department chair can do quite a bit to help to answer a question like, how do we make sure that this particular piece of content, whether it's a pie chart or something else, is actually accessible? So we dip our toe into leadership here, which will be kind of a recurring theme. When leadership leads on this, and when leadership says, no, accessibility is really central to what we're doing with our courses, that conversation tends to move toward a more accessible end result. And that's not necessarily always the case, but certainly if the department chair understands the institution's focus on accessibility in instructional content, then that chair may be much more supportive and may say, well, let's figure out how to make sure that everyone is reasonably happy. The end result is accessible, being the priority. So we've gone now really 2 steps away from the techie piece of this, just trying to answer a question about a particular piece of content. And this could be the same if you have a visible piece of content that needs text equivalent, if it needs alternative text. You know, it may be that the instructional designer knows the content well enough to come up with a text description or a text equivalent of a visual. They may need to rely on that instructor and go through this same kind of process. And it could be, again, the chair that says, yeah, we need to make sure that this happens and that it works well and that we get all of the content that we need, hidden or visible, to make the end result more accessible. So we've moved away from the technical role really, really quickly. And it could be at some point that even if the chair pushes back, or if the chair maybe doesn't push back, but just doesn't understand how accessibility works and the need for it, maybe we bump up to the provost. You know, maybe we have moved up, leveled up, if you will, to a point where our academic leadership is emphasizing that we need to make sure this stuff is accessible. So we've really gotten up to a higher level of leadership on campus to lead on and say, we need to be sure that our content is accessible, that we don't put these barriers up for our students. Because the provost, your academic leadership, typically is going to have a little bit higher charge, you know, and they might not know much about the mechanics of making a chart or graph or any other piece of content accessible. That might not be something that they know as much about. They might fully well realize things like the obligation the institution has. They might keep a little bit of a closer eye on things like institutional risk. So they may be able to make a pretty good case to say, look, this needs to be accessible from the risk standpoint. They might also be able to speak really clearly to the needs of the students and to be able to articulate in a kind of a more global sort of way that we need to be sure that our content for students is accessible for all of these reasons. And a lot of times it can be, pointing back to an institution's mission statement or their diversity statement, or just really placing a focus on the needs of the student, because they're really the ones who drive what we do in the academic sense. So questions up to that point. We're going to come back around to our instructional designer. And I want to think a little bit about, well, how they got the job. If we think about influence on design, our candidates are certainly a huge part of this. When we think about people who might apply for an instructional design job on campus, the whole process of hiring and onboarding somebody has a pretty significant impact on every aspect of instructional design. If you can't find folks who are good at the work, then it's very difficult to move much of anything forward. So I want to quote this. This is from an instructional design position that I think just went around the Cole email distribution list last week, maybe 2 weeks ago. So credit where credit's due. This is from Rogers State University. And this job description says, this is just a part of it that I've excerpted here, but this is the piece about accessibility. So what they've done is they have put a spotlight on accessibility in the job description itself. And what they say is general enough that I think they're in a pretty good position to be able to write questions that get to the heart of, does a candidate know anything about accessibility, without having to really be pinned in by this description. The description excerpt says, and preceding this, it's, I think these were the required skills: have a working knowledge of W3C, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.0 guidelines, Universal Design Language, and Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. So this is not insignificant, I don't think. I think it's really important to work accessibility into job descriptions. And kudos to Rogers. I know they're not the only folks doing this in instructional design and other positions. But I think there are a lot of ripple effects here as well. Again, if candidates see this, then especially if they have the skills, there's a decent chance that they're going to find this position more appealing. From what I've seen just nationally, there aren't that many folks who include accessibility as either a required or a preferred skill in job descriptions. So this is significant. I think you can attract, again, folks that have the skill set, and it lets you ask questions. It lets you do so much with your candidates that you might not otherwise be able to do as easily. So in order to pull this off, you've got to have somebody actually sit down and type that into the job description. It's usually the hiring manager. So whatever that title is on your campus, whether it's your lead instructional designer, maybe you have a role like this under something like a Center for Teaching Excellence. Somebody actually has to sit down and type this job description out, right? And again, that doesn't happen on an island. More than likely, they're going to talk a little bit with their instructional designers about language that makes sense for the role. Because again, you don't want to be so specific that it doesn't really help. You do want to highlight it though. And so someone has to literally sit down and type that job description. And more than likely, depending on your campus, somebody in HR at the very least reads over the job descriptions before they're posted. In some campuses, that structure is more kind of rigid than others, but in a lot of campuses, it's very important, and it's a part of the process that is integral to a job posting. So somebody in HR has to be okay with this as well. And then I think the ripples go out even wider. When you put something in a job description, you have the opportunity, again, to ask questions at an interview and to say to candidates by asking questions about accessibility that this is an important thing. When we bring you on, even if you don't have a strong skill set, you're signaling that you're going to help folks to learn more about accessibility. And whether it's formal continuing education, maybe you have a continuing education budget to, put them on some lynda.com classes that have accessibility basics. Maybe your professional development for accessibility is a matter of mentoring and establishing, kind of your senior instructional designer who knows the most about accessibility, and then works with new hires and existing staff to help to develop that nuts and bolts skill set at their level. So professional development and accounting for accessibility as you train people is one of the biggest ripples that I can think of. I know folks are still struggling with the visuals, and again, you're not missing a ton. I think if I was doing this in person, I don't know if I would even have slides. So I think we should be okay, and we do apologize about the visual issues. So professional development is one of the big ripples, one of the first ripples. Anything that's in a job description is typically up for being measured. I think almost all of us have some kind of annual evaluations. I know at OSU, actually, we're in annual evaluation time. And certainly for my role, accessibility is central to what we measure as far as performance, not only annually, but incrementally when, sit down and talk with my leadership. Accessibility is a central part of it. And when accessibility exists in a job description, and when it's something that you ask about, then you can set goals that are much more specific. You bring on a candidate who doesn't have a lot of accessibility experience, and you say, well, that's okay. You have the technical skills, you fit with what we're doing. We're gonna build up the accessibility skills, and we're gonna measure that over the course of the year in these ways. So again, that professional development plan can lead to some things you actually measure. So that certainly creates an incentive for now the employee, the instructional designer that we have hired. So just knowing that those things will be tracked and measured over time is I think really helpful to, again, making accessibility a program. One of the things too that you can measure is the specific skills. So if your instructional designers are in a specific learning management system and that's really all they work in, then it's easier to set out very specific goals and very specific training and development within an LMS platform. Maybe they're also working in Office. So the level of detail that you can get to by looking at it this way and looking at it from the very beginning is really significant. So what if a candidate has a disability? To circle back around to HR for a moment. HR obviously has the influence over that particular position, but HR also has a tremendous influence over the hiring environment itself. HR might not necessarily, host or be responsible for the technology end of whatever job application platform or system you have, or they might be central to it. They might create PDF forms that you use to collect information from candidates. Your job applications can be, and from what I've seen, are pretty diverse. Some institutions have really big, robust hiring systems where you go in and fill out all your information. You get to usually type in all the information from your resume and then upload a resume at the same time. And then some, again, are PDF forms where folks go in and fill out all the information and email the form in. And in any case, if the candidate has a disability, and if that particular system, whether it's a real robust web application or a set of PDFs, if that system is not accessible, then the candidates themselves hit a wall. They hit a barrier that prevents them from being able to even apply for the job. So there's some shared responsibility here as well. You know, HR has a tremendous influence over the platform side, and especially in a situation where you're creating your own job applications internally, then when HR publishes this stuff, again, if it's not accessible, the influence on the end work, right? I mean, we're still talking about an online class. Well, if you have a really qualified candidate with a disability who encounters a brick wall when they try to apply, then without even knowing it, very possibly your overall quality of your courses is not as high as it could be. I won't say that it's going to drop. It's just not as high as it could be because that candidate has been blocked from the outset. You know, you have this point of entry that's web-based, and if they can't get past it, you don't even see their application. And in a lot of cases, folks will just say, oh, nope, I'm not even going to mess with it. If this system they have is not accessible, then what happens when I show up for work? So they might not even try to find another way to get the information to you. And then they might, and it depends again on HR's response. So there's a pretty direct connection here, even though it seems a little bit of a long trip to get there, where HR has actually quite a bit of influence over a course that your students might take. And HR is usually not the only one, right? In a situation like this, usually responsibility is shared. So we usually have multiple people that have influence over something like a platform choice. Let's say that right now your institution collects all of the application information through PDFs, and you say, we want to have a big system to do this. Well, again, certainly HR has a lot to say about what that system needs to do. IT more than likely will as well, or someone in procurement. There's going to be someone else who comes in and keeps an eye on the technical piece, you know, the really techie kind of requirements, decisions like, do we host this on campus or do we host it offsite in the cloud? You know, decisions like that are likely going to have a more technical voice chiming in to steer that conversation. And so again, I would say that accessibility fits in each one of these different roles on a campus that all influence what you have, that all influence the technology environment that you're serving up to your students. So how high do we go with this? And this is where if you all, I think everyone can hear me at least. So if you can type in an answer into the chat or Q&A, I'm curious to know what you think. How high up in the institution would you want the accessibility message to go? I'll chime in because I have my vote. And this is where I'm trying to steer institutions. This is Mount Rushmore. I think we go all the way to the top of the institution if possible. When you think about who drives and influences what an institution does, when you think about that mission statement, the diversity and inclusion statement that some institutions might have, some institutions around the state have created, chief diversity officer roles. They might not call them that. That's the role that they serve on campus. Certainly, when you get to the chancellor or presidential level, that's really who can carry this stuff forward the most effectively, who can really set the tone for an entire institution. So it's key, I think, to be sure that your institutional leadership all the way to the top can indeed carry this message forward, because they're going to broadcast it, around the entire campus. What I've found when I've worked with institutions where the president or chancellor is in the room as I have a conversation kind of like this, things tend to move forward much more quickly in terms of institution-wide policy, for example. Institutional policy about digital accessibility is surprisingly helpful from what I've seen. There was a time when I didn't really think it was all that important, when I thought, well, the presence of our state law and the broad national civil rights environment, all that stuff, should do it. But I've seen firsthand with institutions in the state how helpful a policy that says we're going to make all of our digital accessible to this set of standards, and we're going to form a plan to do that. Well, those are the campuses that tend to be able to move forward with this notion of an accessibility program in a more robust kind of way, as opposed to, again, having all the eggs in one basket. And one of the things that I've noticed is people, if you hear other people talk about accessibility, you're liable to hear them say that leadership has to support building an accessibility program. And I mean, that's true. The way I look at it, it's much more important for leadership to lead on it. And the difference that I tried to point out there is that if someone's holding a ladder to support work you're doing on the ladder, then that's great. With something like this, I really hope that leadership will get up on the ladder a little bit and demonstrate and show a commitment to accessibility. And that's kind of where we end up with this. You can't really go a whole lot higher than leadership on your campus. And they're key to moving this forward. I know in talking to some folks who may be on, I haven't looked through the whole list of names, and I'm not sure who's out in Facebook. But I know I've talked to a lot of folks around the state who build some stuff that's really, really cool as far as accessibility, and it's very local to them. And even if it's not eggs in one basket, it's the usual silo thing that we talk about in higher education all the time. And when accessibility stays in that silo, it gets to be a challenge and it becomes frustrating for folks. And so hopefully you can see as we've stepped through our different levels of leadership that there are pathways, and there are, I hope, some things that you see that you can maybe talk to your leadership about. I figure anybody who willingly jumps into an accessibility talk, whether it's a webinar or at a conference, we're trying to move toward the same goals, and hopefully you're trying to figure some things out about scaling this up, maybe moving accessibility out of just your department or just your desk if it's that local to you. So hopefully this has helped to kind of shift a couple of things into place. Have I forgotten an influencer? Have I left anybody out that you can think of that's tremendously influential to course design and to online learning in our institutions? I mean, I think that ultimately this comes back to our students, right? We have, yeah, thanks, Joyce says it's most beneficial to hear from students. We have an incredibly diverse student body. We have students of all ages, socioeconomic backgrounds, disabilities, ethnicities. It goes across the board. And especially, I think, with distance education, we have tremendous opportunities to reach more students. And many of the institutions in the state have really committed to full distance ed, as well as much more tightly integrating digital into their in-person classes, much more of a blended learning approach, flipping classrooms to some extent, so on and so forth. So the voice of the students, as Joy points out, is one that I think we can amplify. And when we talk about design, and I say this in the context of instructional design, web design, again, anything digital, it's not about those of us who create the stuff. When I sit down and create anything, a slide deck or an article or whatever it might be, it's not about me. It's not about what I like or don't like about PowerPoint or whatever platform I'm using. It's about whoever I'm trying to get the message to. So I think the biggest influencer and maybe a voice that you can amplify on your own campus in this conversation is that of your students. And with online learning and with distance ed, you don't see your students in a lot of cases. You know, you might have chat, you might have different ways of communicating, but they may or may not really use video. So you never have any idea whether a student has a visible disability, much less an invisible disability. And I can almost guarantee you that every instructor has at some point taught somebody that has a disability in a class, whether it's in the classroom or it's distance ed. So the voice of the student is probably the one that should guide us the most. And again, I hope that we can shift the conversation to thinking about how might our students use what we create. So with that, I want to see what questions you all may have, give you my contact information, and I'll wait and see if anyone types anything in here about anything about this bigger picture conversation, and up to and including, hey Rob, could we follow up later and kind of go through this process on our own campus? You know, one thing about Able Tech is that we do work statewide, and I work with a handful of institutions pretty closely now on things like policy and program building. And with the online consortium, I've been able to get in front of several folks to talk a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts. And I always make this offer, which is whether I'm working with y'all already or not, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to type my email address in the chat. It's rgcarr with 2 R's at okstate.edu. And it looks like I didn't go out here. Well, we've reached the limits of my knowledge with the webinar piece of Zoom. I use Zoom all the time, not webinars.
We'll get it out there. That
Yeah,
it should have gone out to everyone now.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Kyle.
Sure.
Yeah, so feel free to shoot me an email with any kind of questions you have. If you don't have anything here, or if you want to, again, just follow up about kind of the big picture or nuts and bolts of accessibility, then please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'm at RG Jr. on Twitter, which I'm not actually very active on anymore. It is still a good way to get a hold of me as well, if you would like. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you again to Kyle and to the Regents and Cole for hosting this and bringing us all together to talk about accessibility for a little bit this morning. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your mornings as well to come in and hear about, again, a little bit different perspective on this topic. So unless anyone has anything, I will bid you all a great rest of your day, and thank you again.
Thank you, Rob. It just goes to show Murphy's Law. I was just bragging to you right before this how our technical issues have been minimal during the entire summit, and then we have folks that aren't able to see the presentation. I apologize to anybody who wasn't able to. I'm not sure what the problem was, if it was a view issue or what, but it will be recorded, and the recording will contain the full slide deck. So we'll get that posted on the Online Excellence site. So if there's anything that you feel like you missed, please feel free. It should be up today, if not tomorrow, to go out and check out that recording. And once again, thanks, Rob, for this excellent presentation on a topic that is really important and one that we are seeing a lot of increased interest in across our institutions, which I think is a great thing. So thanks again, and hopefully we will be able to see a lot of you here again at 2 p.m. Dr. Dana Linden-Burgett is going to be talking about measurable course objectives for your online courses. So registration is still open on the Online Excellence site to get your link to join. Also live streaming that one on Facebook as well. So hopefully we will see a lot of you this afternoon. And with that, thanks again, Rob, for a great presentation. And everybody have a great morning.